Good morning. Could I start with a matter of housekeeping? 2 points, really. Could I make clear that the access and egress from the inquiry room, as far as legal representatives are concerned, is the door that faces me at the back. The door at my left is exclusively for witnesses and inquiry staff, unless in particular circumstances where a legal representative might be with a member of the inquiry team. So can I ask legal representatives to restrict themselves to the use of the door at the back? Now, the other matter, which is connected, is that I do not expect legal representatives to approach or engage with witnesses within the inquiry space, either in any part of the inquiry office. Now, it may be different. There may be circumstances where the legal representative of a particular core participant whose employee is the witness. There may be circumstances where the legal representative may wish to speak to either, I suppose, a core participant who is a witness, although more likely at this stage that it will be the employee of a core participant. Now, there may be circumstances where the legal representative wishes to speak to, as it were, his or her, might regard as her witness in the sense of an employee. But I do not expect legal representatives to approach or engage with witnesses who do not fall into the category of an employee of the core participant for whom they represent. If there needs to be contact with witnesses, it can be done through their legal representative of the relevant core participant, or by some means outside the inquiry offices. But I would wish witnesses to feel they are free from such approaches within the inquiry offices. So if legal representatives could bear that in mind. Now, with that by way of preliminary, Ms. McClelland, we have Mr. Reekie as our witness.
That's right, my lord. Peter Reekie.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Reekie. As you appreciate, you're about to be asked some questions by Mr. McClelland, who's sitting on my right. But before that, would you make an affirmation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sitting where you are, if you could repeat these words after me. I solemnly and sincerely and truly
I solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm that I will tell the truth,
I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Reekie. Now, you should get help from the microphone, but could I ask you perhaps to speak a little louder than you would in normal conversation?
It's no problem at all.
That's excellent. If you maintain that level, I certainly will be able to hear you clearly.
I'm happy to do
so.
so.
Will be very appreciative of that. Now, Mr. McClelland.
Thank you, my lord. Good morning.
Morning.
Could you please confirm your name?
Peter Reekie.
And you are the Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Futures Trust.
Correct.
You've provided a statement to the inquiry. I think a copy should be in front of you. For everybody else, the bundle references are pages 232 to 299. The contents of that statement, Mr. Reekie, will form part of your evidence to the inquiry, and if you want to refer to it at any time today, then please feel free to say so. Could I begin by asking what your professional qualifications are?
Yeah, I'm a civil engineer by training. I have a degree in engineering science, and I'm a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers.
And when were you appointed a fellow?
I can't remember.
Okay, recently or a long time ago?
I was appointed a fellow relatively recently, within the last 5 years or so, I suppose.
Thank you. And I think you also have a diploma of organisational leadership, is that correct?
That would be correct, yes.
And in turning to your career experience, have you ever worked as a practising engineer?
Yes,
In what field?
in civil engineering.
And give us a broad indication of the type of civil engineering work that you were doing.
So principally, when I was a civil engineer between around about 1994 and 1999, I was involved in wastewater treatment, a little bit of nuclear engineering, some advice on commercial matters around public-private partnerships in the engineering sense a long time ago, but mostly water and wastewater, designing effluent treatment plants and visiting sewers.
Thank you. And after that, I think you moved to an advisory role at PricewaterhouseCoopers, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And what was the nature of the advisory work that you did?
I started off in management consultancy and ended up in corporate finance advisory, advising on transactions mainly at the public-private interface, of which public-private partnerships formed a substantial element of my work, but different forms of commercial deals between the public sector and the private sector.
Okay, and what sort of finance structures were you involved with?
A range of financing structures, but I've been involved in PFI projects, other forms of public-private partnerships, service contracts that require financing behind the scenes to deliver the services, but quite a lot of PFI type projects, including in the healthcare sector.
Okay. And could you just give us a sort of overview of the sort of work that you did in the hospital sector with particular reference to private finance?
I guess the most relevant is that I was lead financial advisor to the Forth Valley Royal Hospital, which was procured through PFI and reached financial close in 2007. I advised the health board on that project, including advising them on the business cases, advising them on the financial, commercial aspects of their procurement.
Thank you. And you mentioned there advising a health board. What other sorts of clients did you advise?
Central government departments, Ministry of Defence, local authorities and private sector consortia that were involved in developing PPP-style projects. I advised overseas governments that were involved in starting off towards doing PPP-type transactions, so providing training and advice to governments around Europe for public-private partnerships.
Okay. And just to be clear, what was the focus of your advisory work? You said you were an engineer. Was it an engineering role or was it a financial role?
Principally financial and commercial advisory, so I would advise on the financial structures, the financial modelling, business cases in as much as it was the value for money side of business cases I was particularly focused on, and things like payment mechanisms, and how the cash flows through the project agreement, and the commercial aspects of procurements and negotiations.
And over what period of time were you doing that work at PricewaterhouseCoopers?
From probably 2000, I think I was appointed, until I left PricewaterhouseCoopers in 2009 to join the Scottish Futures Trust.
Okay. And what role did you take on when you first came to the Scottish Futures Trust?
Well, My first involvement with the Scottish Futures Trust was writing the business case for the organisation as a consulting assignment in PwC. I was then seconded to Scottish Government to help establish the organisation, and I was then appointed as its Director of Finance and Structures as employee number 2.
Okay. And when you say structures, is that structures in the financial sense or the engineering sense?
Financial sense.
And in general terms, what type of work did you do in that role?
Well, one of the roles of the Scottish Futures Trust is to develop and implement innovative financial arrangements to bring additionality of investment into public sector infrastructure assets. So I was responsible for developing some of those structures and running programs of investment that led to additional investment in Scotland's infrastructure, including the non-profit distributing programme of investment.
Okay. And you've described there the NPD programme of investment. Can you just give us an overview of what that was?
Would you like to know about the programme or what NPD is?
The programme.
So the programme was announced in November 2010, and it was a programme of 10 projects delivered as what I would call standalone procurements of individual high-value buildings and other infrastructure assets, roads, using the non-profit distributing form of public-private partnership. And those projects totaled in the order of £2.5 billion. The 10 projects, go through them, but they were in the healthcare, colleges and road sectors. We also ran a sort of parallel programme of financed investment through what we call the HUB programme, which is a slightly different route, but delivers health centres and schools using private finance arrangements.
Okay. And was the work that you were doing at the level of individual projects or at the level of the whole programme?
I managed the whole programme, but I was also involved in most of the individual projects in the programme in one way or another. We were a relatively small organisation, new organisation at the time.
Yeah. And were you involved with the project to develop the Sick Kids Hospital at Little France?
There was.
And an overview, what was the nature of your work on that project?
I had it as part of the portfolio where I was operating at the programme level, so providing reporting to Scottish Government for governance purposes, and I worked with the health portfolio team in Scottish Government, and at specific times I supported NHS Lothian itself on things like, I might come on to it, at the very early stages of the project, the renegotiation of their existing PFI contract with Consort, and at various points during the project's life cycle, tending to be at the difficult points, I've had individual provided support to both our team that was helping with the project, principally Donna Stevenson, but also individually to senior executives in NHS Lothian.
Okay, and you mentioned Donna Stevenson there. Who from the SFT was primarily responsible for the relationship between the SFT and NHS Lothian?
That would be Donna, but at various times other members of the team were involved. So Andrew Bruce had a role, particularly in relation to the financing aspects of the project, so around about what we call the shadow bid model, the outline business case stage, to understand the affordability of the project as a NPD project, and also at the stage during the procurement of the funding competition to bring on the finances of the project company.
Okay, so
There are other members of the team involved at different times as well.
okay, if we could just go through those. So we've got you, we've got Donna Stevenson and Andrew Bruce, you just mentioned.
Yeah, Gordon Sharef was involved for a short period of time when he was seconded into the NHS Lothian project team on an informal basis in the summer of 2011. Colin Proctor had a role as the second reviewer of the final key stage review. Tony Rose had a role as second reviewer of the majority of the key stage reviews. Tony Rose then went on to be the public interest director for project, and Colin Proctor was a member of, was an advisor to the Scottish Government's Capital Investment Group, who would have had an engagement in the business cases for the project.
Now, you mentioned Donna Stevenson and Andrew Bruce at the same time, and then you gave a description of a role. I wasn't clear if that was Andrew Bruce's role that you were describing, or whether that was the role carried out by both him and Donna Stevenson.
Andrew Bruce was particularly involved in the financing aspects of the project. So I mentioned the development of the shadow bid model to test the affordability and the competition for finance for the project. Donna had a role supporting the project more generally through the pre-procurement and procurement stages, where she was a member of the project board and assisted NHS Lothian in implementing the NPD arrangements for the project overall. Things like the standard contract that Scottish Futures Trust owned, if you like, and providing general commercial support through the PPP, the NPD elements of that project development and procurement.
What is Donna Stevenson's professional background?
A lawyer.
Returning briefly to Andrew Bruce, you mentioned that he was involved in work to test the affordability of the project. Could you just briefly explain what you mean by testing its affordability?
Yeah. If you have a project that is procured as a capital project, then the affordability of the project is determined by an estimate usually done by quantity surveyors as to what the capital cost of the building will be. When you procure a project through a public-private partnership like non-profit distributing, then the affordability of the project relates to what the annual payment would be for the building once it is in use. We call it the unitary charge. And the unitary charge is a figure, an annual figure that is derived from the capital cost of the building, the cost of finance that gets raised to pay the builder to build the building that then has to be repaid, and then the annual cost of maintaining the building and its life cycle, so replacing bits of it over, let's say, a 25-year life of the contract. So by way of a very simple example, if you had a building that might cost £150 million as a capital project, then you would have to borrow that £150 million. You would repay that over the 25 years. You would also pay for the maintenance over the 25 years, and you might pay £15 million a year for 25 years rather than 150 million. So the act of determining the affordability is building an Excel financial model, contains all of those cost input lines and the financing that turns the 150 million capital cost plus an estimate of the maintenance costs and life cycle costs with some financing assumptions into a fixed annual unitary charge, let's say £15 million, because it's usually about a ratio of 10 to 1. So overall, you pay more than £150 million because you're paying for the building and the financing and the maintenance.
So in short, would it be fair to describe that as a detailed task of financial analysis?
It's a financial modelling exercise, yes.
And turning then to Donna Stevenson.
Sorry just to interrupt.
Of course.
Because I have to say, affordability is not something which I think maybe I'd fully understood previously. I do understand that perhaps calculation has a number of elements, but what it really comes to is how much this building is going to cost. And you've expressed it in an annualized basis of how much is the building going to cost a year.
That's right.
Or is that an oversimplification?
It's not it's a good simplification, but I suppose the point is, if a building is being bought using capital budgets, then the analysis of how much it's going to cost is adding up the cost of the steel, the brickwork, the design, etc. If we're trying to work out a unitary charge, then we have to add in significantly important assumptions around the cost of finance, for example, and how that finance will be structured in order to turn the £150 million that it might cost into the annual payment. And there's quite a lot of financial modelling involved in that, because the cost of servicing the building, of maintaining it over 25 years, is not a flat sum. It has spikes when the roof needs to be replaced, or when the boilers need to be replaced, or whatever it may be. And the financial model that's developed to understand the affordability takes out those spikes and flattens them through financial engineering, effectively, to turn it into a fixed sum that is paid annually to have the building made available. So we call it pay as you build, £150 million, pay as you build, or pay as you use, £15 million a year as you use. And some of that 15 million is inflated because cost of facilities management goes up every year, but it's basically a fixed annual payment for the availability of the building.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. McLennan.
No, not at all. I'm obliged, my lord. You mentioned Donna Stevenson,
yeah.
and I think what you said was that she was providing more general support and helped NHSL implement the commercial aspects of the NPD arrangements. Could you just elaborate a little bit on her role, please?
Yeah, so there's quite a procurement of an NPD, a form of PPP project, is quite a different exercise from the capital project, and it has a different risk arrangement between the public sector and the private sector. It has a whole different set of contractual arrangements through the NPD project agreement, and the procurement process was a competitive dialogue procurement process. So there's a whole bunch of aspects in how you specify the building differently, which is a technical side that we didn't get involved in, but also the commercial structuring of that transaction and procurement, if you like, that are different from if it was a capital building. And Donna provided support to NHS Lothian in the restructuring of their procurement processes and of their commercial arrangements to help change the project from being a capital project into being a non-profit distributing PPP project. And that involvement included acting as I said, as a member of the project board, so being part of the governance arrangements, and support with understanding, as I said, that the commercial elements of implementing the different project agreement that you need for a PPP style project.
I realise it was a while ago, but do you know over what period Ms Stevenson was a member of the project board? Not off the top of my head, but my estimation is that you would have joined at some point in 2011, when the project was sort of more firmly established as an NPD project. I think I attended some of the early project boards during that period, and then she would have been there at least until financial close, which from memory was 2015, was it? But I think she stayed on the project board thereafter as well during the construction phase, because Donna's role now is in relation to operational PPP contract management, where SFT has a centre of expertise, and she has provided ongoing support to NHS Lothian in relation to the operation of the contract and implementing their contract management arrangement. Mm-hmm. So I think she stayed on for after financial close. And what was the nature of Donna Stevenson's role on the project board?
To provide input and expertise in the NPD elements of considerations of that board.
Was she there to any extent in a decision-making capacity?
I would have said no, but that board at various times during its life, my understanding, was known as the Project Steering Board and the Project Board. So I didn't sit around the table. I think I did go to a number of meetings, but I didn't sit around the table much, so I couldn't tell you the extent to which that was a decision-making board.
I mean, do you recall performing any decision-making function when you were there?
No.
Okay. Now, it's entirely my fault because I'm the one asking the questions, but we've slightly gone off the where I'd intended to be. So just returning to your position at the SFT, were you promoted in 2014?
Yeah. I think I became the Deputy Chief Executive in 2014 and then the Chief Executive in, I want to say, 2018. Time flies.
And after you were promoted to the position of Deputy CEO, did you remain involved in the Sick Kids project?
Yes.
And did the nature of your role change in relation to that project?
I would say that coincided around about the time of the project moving to the construction phase, so the nature of all of our roles changed because we had a particular involvement during the pre-contract stage.
Okay. And if we just look briefly at the Scottish Futures Trust itself, you explain in your statement that it was set up in 2008. Can you just describe for us what the SFT is?
The Scottish Futures Trust is a public body, a company wholly owned by Scottish ministers, and our job is to help improve the value for money of infrastructure investment by the public sector in Scotland, to improve outcomes from infrastructure, both economic outcomes, but also social and environmental outcomes from infrastructure. We do that by working sort of collaboratively and in between central government, local government and industry to work on the planning of future infrastructure, how we can plan better, prioritise what we need, innovation in the funding, financing and delivery of infrastructure, so different ways to fund things, different ways to finance things, managing programmes of delivery, as we've already referred to, and optimising the maintenance and use of existing infrastructure.
And to what extent is it under the direction of the Scottish Government?
The Scottish Government is the owner of the Scottish Futures Trust, but our activities are overseen by a board, and the board are appointed by Scottish ministers.
And are the Scottish ministers ultimately accountable to Parliament for the activities of the SFT?
I believe the Scottish Parliament can inquire directly of us on about our activities, and indeed they can inquire of Scottish ministers about our activities.
Again, apologies for interruption. The question was, to what extent is the Scottish Future Trust under the direction of Scottish Government? You've explained that it's a non-departmental public body. You, I think, paraphrase that by saying that Scottish Government is the owner.
Indeed.
It certainly is the owner
The
in the sense that the owner of the shares, and it appoints the board members. So do I conclude from these answers that you would consider it under the direction of Scottish Government?
No, the Scottish Government and Scottish ministers agree to our 5-year corporate plan, which is the overall activities of the organisation, what we're trying to achieve over a 5-year period. Then, after that sort of broad agreement of our activities, our annual business plan and our management of our activities is overseen by our board, who, as I say, are appointed by Scottish ministers, but it is our board that oversees our activity.
Thank you.
Could we please have a document from Bundle 7 at page 5, please?
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Reekie, I hope that document's up on screen before you. Can you see it okay?
Yes.
Do you recognise that document?
Yes.
And can you tell us what it is, please?
Management Statement and Financial Memorandum of the Scottish Futures Trust, which is our overall governing document between Scottish Government and Scottish Futures Trust.
And we see on the page a date, 26 October 2009.
Yeah.
Is that the statement which has been in place since that date, and is it still in place now?
It's currently being updated, remains in place.
Okay. If we go to page 6, please. I'm just going to read from paragraphs 1 and 2. It says there, introduction, this management statement and associated financial memorandum have been drawn up by the Scottish Government Finance Directorate in consultation with Scottish Futures Trust, Public Corporation and Company Limited by Shares. Paragraph 2, subject to the provisions of any future legislation relating to SFT, the management statement sets out the broad framework within which SFT will operate, in particular, the SFT's overall aims, objectives and targets in support of the Scottish Minister's wider strategic aims, powers and guidelines relevant to the exercise of SFT's functions, duties and powers, conditions under which any public funds are paid to SFT, and how SFT is to be held to account for its performance. There's a reference there to that being subject to the provisions of any future legislation. Is there anything of relevance in legislation subsequent to that document which we should be aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
And we see at paragraph 6, the guiding principle shall be that while at all times meeting high standards of propriety and of good financial management, SFT will have the maximum operational independence.
Yep.
And so whilst you referred to the extent of the government's control over the governance, but there's a sort of day-to-day independence in the operations of the SFT.
That's right. I described the 5-year cycle with which ministers agree to our overall corporate plan, but at any more granular level than that, it's we operate with operational independence underneath our board.
And then if we move on to page 9, please, you see the section Functions, Duties and Powers, subheading Status. 1.1.2, SFT was established by the Scottish Ministers in September 2008 as a new arm's-length body to support the efficiency and effectiveness of public infrastructure planning, funding and delivery, leading to real and improved value for money solutions. And then further on, 2.1.1, the aim of the Scottish Futures Trust is to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of infrastructure investment in Scotland by working collaboratively with public bodies, commercial enterprises, leading to better value for money, and providing the opportunity to maximise the investment in the fabric of Scotland and hence contribute to the Scottish Government's single overarching purpose to increase sustainable economic growth. And then page 10, 2.2.1, SFT's key objectives across the infrastructure investment cycle are 1, to improve value for money in infrastructure investment, and so on. So do we have there a sort of fair overview of at least these functions of the SFT?
Yeah, it's kind of, I hope it's similar to what I said.
Yes, well, indeed. And how does the SFT go about improving efficiency and effectiveness of infrastructure investment?
Our job is to help public bodies, by which I mean government departments, other public bodies, local government, to go about their infrastructure business across the whole life cycle better. So we're a centre of infrastructure expertise, and we do that by working with partners to innovate in new ways of doing things, by managing programmes of activity effectively, so joining up activities that might have previously be done by individual bodies and turning them into programs of activity across multiple bodies, by brokering collaborations on individual projects, and by helping those bodies to, said before, manage their assets more effectively and make the best use of the assets we have. So we provide guidance, we publish guidance on how to do things, and we work with groups of bodies and individual bodies to implement best practice.
So in broad terms, you're helping other bodies to deal with their investments?
Yes, so we don't have a capital budget to make our own, of our own infrastructure to invest. We don't have assets of our own. Our job is to help other bodies work better to invest in, manage and maintain their assets, and also at the same time to work better with the private sector and industry to do that as well in the interests of the wider Scottish economy.
And approximately how many staff did the SFT have over the period it was involved with the Sick Kids project?
I wouldn't like to say. We have 75 now, and we had 0 in May 2009. And my guess is that we would have been 40-ish maybe by that time. A bit speculative, I'm afraid.
No, that's understood. And from what professional backgrounds did those staff generally come?
We had a very wide range of infrastructure professionals, including people from a financial background, including accountants and financiers, lawyers, people from technical backgrounds, including quantity surveyors, project managers, and architects. We had economists, planners, probably 1 or 2 more developers, people with property development experience. So a wide range of infrastructure-related professional backgrounds.
Was there anybody in the SFT from an engineering background who was using their engineering background in their role with the SFT?
I don't believe so. Well, I mean, I can't avoid using my engineering background, but I was not employed directly to be an engineer.
Okay. And returning to the document that's on screen, if we go to 2.3.1, we see guiding principles. In striving to meet its objectives, SFT will be guided by 1, proper recognition of the financial and non-financial aspects of value for money, and then 4, positive impact of high-quality design and space planning on people's lives. So do we see there that the SFT has at least some interest in design?
Absolutely, yeah, we do.
And to what end?
To improve people's lives through high-quality design. I guess the well-designed public infrastructure is good for meeting its purpose of delivering services to people. It's good for places and have a positive impact on the environment, on places, and on people.
Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned earlier in your evidence the budget announcement in 2011 to 2012 about the £2.5 billion programme of investment using the NPD model.
So that was the 2011-12 budget in 2010, yeah.
So, correct, thank you.
All right.
Had the NPD model been used in Scotland before that?
Yes.
To what extent?
There was, I would say, 5 or 6 in that order of NPD projects before that time. It was first used in Argyll and Bute for a bundle of, I think, 5 schools. So the model was developed during the early to mid 2000s, and that Argyll and Bute schools project, I think, reached financial close. So the deal was done in, I believe, 2005. It had been used principally for schools, but it had also been used on health projects as well.
What health projects had it been used for?
A project for a mental health facility in Tayside.
And you say it's a mental health facility, so not an acute hospital like the sick kids?
That's correct.
And to what extent did the draft budget announcement herald an increase in the use of NPD in Scotland?
It heralded a significant increase in the use of NPD. So that announcement of 10 projects at one time was more than had been done before.
And how similar to or different from a traditional PFI structure was the NPD structure?
It's in many ways very similar, and it has a small number of quite important differences. So overall, forms of public-private partnership are for the design, build, finance and maintain of a public asset. So it creates a contractual partnership, if you like, between the public sector and the private sector for that design, build, finance and maintain. The structure of the organisations that come together on the private sector side are relatively similar between PFI. The approach to procurement is similar. The approach to specification is similar. The differences are in the corporate structure of the project company that's brought together to deliver the project, where on a PFI project, that private sector project company has share capital equity in the normal sense of share capital, where profits can be made from it. So if the private sector party is able to deliver the services of designing, building, financing and maintaining the asset at lower cost, then they get to make more profits than was originally anticipated. In an NPD arrangement, the NPD stands for non-profit distributing. So the share capital of the project company is not allowed through the articles of the company to distribute any profits that it makes. The investors in that company therefore receive a maximum of the fixed return that they tendered through returns on subordinated debt. If they are not able to perform, they still take the same risk of downside as was the case in PFI. But if they want to overperform, then any surpluses of cash developed by that company are returned to the public sector rather than going out as enhanced profits, if you like, to the private sector.
Okay, so
non-profit distributing, profit cap, fixed rate of finance, and the second difference, sorry, if I may, is that there is an enhanced level of transparency on the operation of that private sector company through having a public interest director on its board, and that public interest director is there to make sure that those non-profit distributing principles are upheld.
Okay, if you look back from the detail at a higher sort of overview, we take a public-private finance project as involving the design, build, finance and maintain aspects. Are the main differences between NPD and the traditional models really in the finance part of that? And are the design and build elements broadly the same?
The D&B subcontract in an NPD would be very, very similar to the D&B subcontract in a PFI project, as would the facilities management. Yeah.
Thank you. If we could go please to bundle 7, page 101. Now, Mr. Reekie, what you're seeing there is a page in the middle of a document. And if you just take it from me that this is the Scottish Government's draft budget for 2011-2012.
I recognise it.
You recognise it, good. And I just want to put to you the paragraph at the top of page 101, which reads, "This new pipeline of NPD projects is being targeted to provide the maximum support for the wider capital programme and for Scotland's key public services. The Scottish Government will seek to deliver each project as early as possible in order to accelerate its benefits to citizens and to the wider economy." And I just want to ask you about that policy of delivering the projects as early as possible. Can you comment on that, please?
Well, if we had the time to go through the whole document, we would understand that it was in the context of an unprecedented reduction in budgets coming from Westminster through the immediately preceding spending review, for which the wider context was the global financial crisis of 2007-8. So there was a substantial slowing of the economy at the time. There was a reduction in budgets, and there was a desire from the Scottish Government to support the economy through delivering capital investment, construction activity, and also to make sure that its aspirations for the benefits of capital investment to citizens, i.e. new schools, new health centres, new hospitals, new roads, were not delayed by the, or not delayed any more than was necessary by that budgetary reduction that had come through the spending review.
And to what extent was the desire to avoid delay a feature of the delivery of the Sick Kids project?
It was part of the context of all of the projects in the programme.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that answer. Could you repeat it for me?
It was part of the context of all of the projects in the programme.
Okay, so it's part of the context, but to what extent did it feature as a driving force, if you like, of the Sick Kids project?
It was one of the driving elements of that project. So any project is primarily there to deliver the best outcomes, and the outcomes that were sought from that project are to deliver the benefits to citizens of having the new hospital. So for that, it needs to be a high quality asset that meets the service demands of the NHS that it was there to deliver for, and the sooner those demands can be met and the new facility can be occupied, obviously we accelerate the benefits. So being able to accelerate benefits and that the co-benefit of the economic activity that came through the delivery phase were one of the things that were driving that project. But overall, it's about maximising benefits. So the programme element of it is one of the benefits. The quality element is one of the benefits. The cost element is one of the drivers and benefits.
Okay, thank you. Did the announcement of the new NPD programme, and in particular the role of the SFT in relation to it, bring about a change in the SFT's role, either in scope or in scale?
We were a relatively new organisation at that stage, having become fully operational in 2009 after being formed, as you said previously, at the back end of 2008. So the organisation was changing quite rapidly at that time, and the introduction of this programme was one of those changes, absolutely, yes.
Is it fair to say that at the time of the announcement, the SFT's role in relation to the new NPD programme was yet to be fully defined?
Yeah.
And was it necessary following the announcement to do more to define that role?
Yes.
For example, by putting in place policies and procedures?
Yes.
And how long did it take to complete that process?
I would say that elements of that were developed over a number of years. Some of the key elements came through, for example, the March 2011 funding conditions letter from Scottish Government to NHS chief executives, which set out in broad terms what SFT's role would be across the health elements of the NPD programme. There were similar things going on with other portfolios that had projects in the programme. It was further defined through our value for money guidance, our assurance procedures that were published over the following months.
Yeah, thank you. You say in your statement that the NPD model was familiar to the market. And just for the record, the reference is paragraph 69 of your statement. First of all, by the market, who are you referring to?
Could I just turn to that, please?
Yes, of course. It's page 258 of the witness statement bundle.
The market being the parties who come together to do the designing, building, financing and maintaining in a PPP contract. So I mean sponsors, people who provide risk capital and draw consortia together, the banks and other financial institutions that provide senior debt, the construction contracting marketplace and the facilities management marketplace were in general had been involved in PFI, and specifically most of them that were active in Scotland were aware of the particular differences for NPD, and therefore the market was, the bidding marketplace was informed about that overall structure and was familiar with working within it.
Okay. And what about NHS Lothian itself? Are you able to say to what extent they were familiar with the NPD model?
NHS Lothian had previously used the PFI, Private Finance Initiative, for the development of the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh and other projects, and therefore had experience of design, build, finance and maintain through PFI. And we've already been through the level of difference between NPD and PFI. So they had that familiarity from having used PFI before, but I wouldn't like to say whether the individuals around were around and in what roles they were around last time they did a procurement of that nature.
Is the NPD model still used?
No.
And why is that?
The NPD model, as we've said, from the budget document was there to deliver additionality of investment capacity over and above capital budgets. And due to a change in European accounting rules, and technically a move from ISA 95 to ISA 10, which occurred in 2014, the ability of NPD and similar forms of contract to deliver additionality of investment was reversed. So they were no longer able to deliver more investment than we had capital budgets for at the time, because you would still need the capital budget. So due to that change in accounting rules, the benefit of that additionality disappeared, and we stopped using NPD.
Okay, you used the term there, additionality. By that, do you mean add to the amount of capital investment that can be made beyond what's available in the public accounts?
Yeah, so the draft budget that you're referring to previously was showing that capital budgets decreased, and the idea of the £2.5 billion programme of investment was that we would be able to make that amount more investment over those years than we had capital budgets.
Yeah.
Just so that I'm understanding, you refer to a change in the European accounting rules in 2014. So it was a change rather than a reinterpretation.
That's correct.
Right. And the effect of the change was that a funding through a mechanism such as NPD would no longer be regarded, or rather would henceforth be regarded as the equivalent of capital, or is that an oversimplification?
Oh, that's a good simplification. Again, the point is that even if you decided to pay as you use under the NPD model, then you would still need capital budget cover during the period at which the asset was constructed, because for budgetary purposes, the asset would be classified to the public sector. And that was because of that change in European ruling, and the Eurostat, the European body that looks after those rules, came and looked at one of our contracts, decided that under those new rules, the assets would be classified to the public sector.
Thank you.
If NPD is no longer available, are there any private finance structures which would be appropriate for the construction of hospitals in Scotland?
Scottish Futures Trust gave advice to Scottish Government in, I think I would say 2019, that another design, build, finance and maintain arrangement, which is again a further development of EPPs, called MIM, the mutual investment model, would still be able to deliver additionality. And the difference between NPD and MIM is that the NPD arrangements, as we've talked, financially cap the returns to the private sector through not having profit distributing equity. The mutual investment model moves from a capping to a sharing mechanism where the private sector can make a portion of the returns, the public sector can also make a proportion, and the public sector returns are in a minority. Those arrangements have been assessed as still able to deliver additionality, so to be classified to the private sector under the most recent ESA 10 European accounting rules.
And is the MIM structure one which is in use for any infrastructure projects in Scotland?
Not currently being used, but it is in consideration by Scottish Government.
Okay, and then just in very general terms, how would we see, or how would you see rather, the role of the SFT in relation to those sorts of projects?
Sorry, what sort of project?
MIM projects, if any come along.
That would have to be determined at the time.
Is it yet to be determined? Could we go please to a document in Bundle 3, Volume 1? At page 1107. Now, I hope in front of you, Mr. Reekie, you should see an email exchange between you and Mike Baxter from 22 and 23 November 2010.
Yep.
And Mr. Baxter is saying, Pete, do you have the proposal we discussed last week? Following on from my meeting with Barry this afternoon, I want to be clear prior to tomorrow's meeting on the basis of your engagement with them and what we expect of Lothian over the next 4 to 6 weeks.
Yep.
And then you say, in confidence for our discussion. And if we move on to page 1111, do we see there the paper that you forwarded to Mike Baxter?
Yes.
And that's headed up Royal Hospital for Sick Children and Department for Clinical Neurosciences. And given this is in and around November 2010, we understand that this is coming very soon after the NPD announcement for the sick kids.
Yeah, I believe less than a week.
Less than a week, okay. And just reading the first couple of paragraphs, paragraph 1, introduction. Following the announcement that the sick kids and DCN are to be delivered as revenue finance projects under the NPD structure, this note sets out for discussion thoughts on the potential way forward. It's based on SFT's current understanding of the project scope and status. In paragraph 2, scope. The project scope as an NPD and affordability need to be considered together. What was the SFT's interest in scope?
The scope of the project, i.e., in very broad terms, what the building would contain, how big it would be, what its nature as an asset would be. It would obviously determine its cost. And when looking at managing the overall budgets for the programme, we need to understand the scale aspect of the scope, to understand how it fits into the programme level budgets, and therefore its affordability. So in my mind, when you at the very highest level thinking about the affordability of a building, you usually work on its size in square meters and its cost per square meter. So a lot of people that work in the construction related industries would be able to give you sort of rules of thumb on the cost per square meter for different sorts of buildings. So if we get an idea of, as we say there, 75,000 square meter facility, then we can kind of understand 75,000 square meter big, and usually these things are in the order of £3,000 a metre, whatever it may be. So we can get a sense of the overall budget and therefore the scale of its as part of the programme.
Okay. But at this point in time, how much did the SFT know about the Sick Kids Hospital?
Not very much.
Right. And if we move on then to page 1112, at paragraph 4, we have interface with existing sick kids procurement. There will need to be a rapid consideration by NHSL and its advisors of the exit from the current NHS framework contract. It may be beneficial to transfer elements of design work undertaken to the new procurement. SFT is not involved in the framework and cannot really advise in this area. Then 5, preparing for procurement. Consideration will be needed at an early stage of how much the design should be progressed in-house and how much in competition through the NPD procurement. There is an opportunity with recent accounting rules changes to undertake more design, especially overall massing, adjacencies and even layouts in-house, with the preferred bidder taking on detailed design for construction. And just in that context, what was the SFT's interest in the design?
The acquisition in the broader sense of a building like a hospital, from the idea that you want to have a new one, has in many ways two parallel strands going along. One is the commercial approach to buying it, and the other is the design aspect of what it's going to look like from the initial idea to something that you can then build. And the interaction of those two things is particularly important during the early stages of the development of the project. We were interested in the programme and the approach to procurement, and therefore understanding how the design was being developed or would developed, and therefore that interaction between the procurement bit that we were particularly interested in and the other strand of development, the technical side, was important for our work.
Okay. And you were saying here that consideration would be needed at an early stage of how much the design should be progressed in-house and how much in competition through the NPD procurement. And then you refer to an opportunity from recent accounting rules to do more in-house. Can you just expand on that point, please?
The reference to accounting rules is unfortunately a deeply technical point that in and around, I want to say April 2009, the accounting in UK for transactions of this nature, PPP projects, had changed, and the accounting moved, or the budgeting moved from being considered under FREM, which is the government's accounting manuals and uses international financial reporting standards, to the budgeting being considered under the mechanism I referred to before, the Eurostat ESA at that time, ESA 95, and the FREM arrangements under international financial reporting standards are a control-based framework. The ESA 95 is a risk-based framework, and the implication of that change, when you filter it all down, was that it was possible to achieve the endpoint that we were looking for, which was that additionality of investment, so a private classification of the asset with a little bit more of the definition of the asset, so the early stages of design done in the public sector rather than under the previous IFRIC rules. A lot of that would have to have been done by the private sector, determining the nature of the asset in order to lead to a private classification. I'm sorry if that's a bit of a mouthful.
No, I think it's clear enough. And if the board undertook more design in-house, what impact would that have on design risk, and in particular the allocation of design risk between the health board and the project company?
So that has to be defined in the contract, and I guess there's two things. One is how much design work is done in the public sector and then shared with the private sector through the tendering phase, and the other is where in the contract that comes at the end of all of that, the liability for that design work that has been undertaken sits. And those are two slightly different things. So we need to unpick all of that to understand the difference between contractually the difference in risk allocation.
Was advice on the allocation of design risk between the health board and the project company something which fell within the remit of the SFT?
We were involved in the interaction between that and the rest of the commercial documentation.
So you said you were involved in the interaction between that and the rest of the commercial documentation. What do you mean by the commercial documentation?
The project agreement.
And when you say you were involved in the interaction between that and the project agreement, can you just expand a little bit on what you mean by that?
Well, the project agreement that was an SFT standard form document contained all of the main clauses of what you might call the front end of the contract, and it then pointed, just the way in these things, to a whole bunch of schedules for the technical, financial, and other aspects, financing elements, and the technical schedules at the back end of the contract were usually project specific and contained, as a generality, a set of authorities' requirements and a set of project companies' proposals that interacted together. But they also then had to interact with the front end, the main clauses of the contract. So the way that interaction through things like the definitions of terms, the front end and the back end fixed together, is obviously something that we, as the owners of the front end of the contract, were interested in.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if maybe we might just tease that out just a little bit. I mean, the project agreement is the eventual, tell me if I'm wrong about this, is the eventual contract between the client, who in this case was NHSL,
yep,
and context of the NPD. I think it's the special purpose
project company, special purpose vehicle.
Yeah. So I'm understanding this. SFT had a standard form contract to take off the shelf to hand over to parties.
Yep.
But when we're talking, again, tell me if I'm wrong about any of this, but when we're talking about allocation of design risk, that would depend on the specific terms of the appendices, which you've described as the back end of the contract.
The schedules, yeah. So
sorry.
Or the parts of the schedule, if you want to
use the word schedules.
Yeah.
So,
but
I think my question comes to be: does the SF, as a matter of generality or particularity, does the SFT have any role in relation to the terms of the schedules?
No, the schedules, the particular schedules that deal with design risk are the authorities' requirements, contractors' proposals, so the technical schedules and the allocation of different elements of design risk, I suppose, run through an analysis of all of that element. And the technical parts of the schedule were developed by the authority, in this case Lothian, and their own technical advisors. But they had to interact with the front end of the contract, which was our standard form.
Sorry, Ms. Winkler.
Yeah, I'm obliged, my lord. Ms. Reekie, if I could have my own go at just teasing out some of that. Did the SFT standard form contract have a settled position on the allocation of design risk between the health board and the project company?
I feel that that's a very precise contractual question, which I'd want to be able to do a precise contractual analysis to be able to give you the proper answer to.
Okay, well, I don't want to put you on the spot and ask you to do something you're not comfortable with, but in commercial terms, did you at the SFT have a view on what the standard form contract was intended to do in terms of the allocation of risk, the allocation of design risk between the procuring body and the project company?
The highest level intent is that the responsibility for the design, the build, the finance and the maintain sits with the private sector parties. So that's the private sector, through their subcontracts, obviously design facilities, take the risk in that design meeting the authority's requirements. But the reason for detailed hesitancy is that if it's the private sector's responsibility to design to meet the authority's requirements, the way that the authority's requirements are expressed determines the exact nature of how different elements of risk are transferred.
And again, I don't want to ask you a technical legal question. The inquiry can look at the contract and take a view on that. But just in commercial terms, was there an understanding about what the standard form contract or what element of design risk it left with the health board?
Yeah, so the generality of this position, I suppose, is that operational functionality, which is the nature of how the different spaces in the building interact with each other, was a risk that would lie with the authority, the public sector. And the purpose of that is that the authority best knows how they want to use the building and therefore what should be next door to what, and what size of a room is necessary to do certain activities in, and how that is then delivered, and how the detailed architectural design, structural design, services design, etc., turn that into a completed building sits with the private sector.
Yeah.
So the operational functionality is generally a spatial concept of what goes next to what, how the spaces interact with each other.
Okay, and you've referred to the fact that the SFT, and this is my word rather than yours, but it essentially was the gatekeeper of the standard form contract terms.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that,
yeah.
that term? And so was the SFT interested in anything which, in a project-specific contract, altered that intended allocation of design risk?
Yes, because that alters the commercial position of the transaction, and ultimately could affect, as we've talked about before, whether it could deliver additionality and meet the overall aims of the programme.
And I think the phrase that you used earlier on was that the SFT was involved in the interaction between the front end and the back end of the contract.
Yeah.
Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I did say that, I think.
Yeah. And is that an element of it that the project-specific elements in the back end of the contract, in the schedules, may have an impact on achievement of the intended design risk allocation between project company and procuring body? And is that the issue that you said the SFT had an interest in?
Yeah, in broad terms, we were trying to maintain the concept of a design, build, finance and maintain contract. So whilst there's an awful lot of technical detail that sits in how that's specified, in broad terms, how the commercial outcome of that was something that we were interested in, yes.
Okay, thank you. If you could go please to page 1113 of the bundle. That's paragraph 6 of the document that we were looking at a while ago. And what you've said here is NHS Lothian will need appropriate advisory support, financial, technical and legal, to bring forward a complex NPD procurement.
Yep.
And just in broad terms, can you explain why NHS, or why in your view NHSL would need that sort of advisory support?
Yep. The financing elements we've talked about already, and the financial modelling that's required to understand the affordability of a unitary charge, that annual payment, and the board would have to be able to evaluate tenders that came in which had financing elements in them, so rates of return and all of the other elements of a financing package, and to analyse the bidder's financial models. So you would need financial advisors to be able to do that. The technical advice was required both for the design and build element and for the maintenance element, to be able to specify the design and build and specify the life cycle maintenance that was needed in a way that suited the NPD and wider PPP forms of contract that we've just talked about, and then to be able to evaluate tenders that came in and ultimately to score them. And the legal advice is required to both deal with the legal issues of the procurement, adhering to procurement regulations, but also principally to create from our standard form a project agreement for the NPD contract, and to evaluate any legal aspects that came in through the tendering process as well, very high level terms. Okay.
One of the aspects of advisory support you referred to there was to assist with specifying the design and build elements. Mm-hmm. And I think what you said was to do that in a way which suited the NPD project.
Yep.
Was there a difference in the way that you would specify things between a traditional capital funded design and build and an NPD project?
There's difference in the way that you specify between different sorts of capital, and indeed between capital procurement and the NPD. And as I said, for PPP styles, you need to specify the life cycle element as well as the design and build element. Yes.
Okay, and is that the main difference, that you've got that life cycle element involved?
The life cycle element is a big difference. The design and build is how you specify design and build is different between lots of different sorts of design and build contracts, and this would be the design and build element, as we talked about, is a fixed price lump sum design and build contract with an authority's requirement and a project code's proposals for this form of procurement.
Thank you.
Wondering what you take away from that answer. I take your point that one can no doubt write a variety of technical specifications in respect of, for example, a capital-funded design and build contract. Mm-hmm. But was Mr. Buchanan correct to say that in relation to the technical element of the advisory support, the difference introduced by, I suppose, either by an NPD or any other revenue-funded model would be specifying in such a way as to include the length, the service element.
Yeah, so if you're just buying a capital project, you don't need to specify the facilities management aspect or the condition of the asset for 25 years. You just need to specify how you want it to look when it's handed over to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Could we go, please, to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 314? Mr. Reekie, what you should have in front of you there is a paper to the Finance and Performance Review Committee of NHSL for their meeting on the 12th of January 2011. So a couple of months or thereabouts after the draft budget announcement. Yep. And just to put this in context, I'll read from paragraph 1.1, which says, "The purpose of this report is to provide the Finance and Performance Review Committee with an overview of the progress made over recent weeks to review the RHSC and DCN reprovision projects following the Scottish Government announcement on 17 November 2010 that these projects would be funded under the NPD model." And we see there, paragraph 2.1, the second bullet, "The committee is invited to approve progressing with a detailed reference design for a combined project as a key component of the NPD procurement route." Was that an approach which the SFT had or approved or supported at that stage?
Yes. So we were keen on the approach of further developing a reference design.
And just to elaborate on why the SFT was keen on that.
Because if you take a reference design forward further in the public sector, then the bidding costs and bidding period are likely to be reduced because there is less high-level design work during the competitive phase of the procurement, and also critically there's less interaction needed with the clinical teams during the competitive phase of the procurement, and clinical teams have obviously got other things to do, and being able to manage them not having to interact with 2 or 3 different bidders as they develop a design from scratch during the procurement phase is good for clinical resources, so good for the delivery of the service overall. And that's because the reference design would contain these principles of operational functionality that I talked about. So what needs to be next to what rooms do we need in order to make this building work for delivering the services? And it allows the competitive phase to progress more quickly and with a lower element of cost or design cost for the private sector once they're still in competition. So it can be quite costly to do this design work, and having bidders do it at risk when they're still into maybe a 1 in 3 chance of winning is quite a high investment level. So it's good overall for the market to be able to keep that to a minimum.
Okay, thank you. Then, and then at page 316, at 4.3, the paper says the key features of the current NPD model are traditional benefits of PPP with regard to risk transfer. Now, I appreciate this is not a paper that you drafted, but what would you understand that to be referring to?
So at a high level, I suppose we've talked about the design risk lying largely with the private sector. The price risk of the design and build element is very firmly with the private sector, and the public sector does not pay anything until the asset is met its completion tests. The maintenance of the facility in a usable condition and available to be used for the full, in this case, 25-year term, sits with the private sector. So the public sector, the authority, NHS Lothian in this case, only pays once the building is available to be used, and if any element of it ceases to be available to be used in the future, then they don't have to pay for that element at that time.
Thank you.
And they have a fixed price for that for 25 years.
And then at 4.4, just reading from that, it says, the SFT is to take a central role in the capital infrastructure programme across Scotland and will provide advice and guidance on all NPD projects, of which a pipeline of projects is now anticipated. One of the key matters to be clarified is the explicit roles and responsibilities of SFT and the distinct board-appointed technical, legal or financial advisors. Yep. Was that a point about the need to clarify the SFT's role a fair comment at the time?
Yes.
And was that because the SFT's role, or rather, why was that? Why was there uncertainty?
I guess we've already said that this was for a meeting that occurred a small number of weeks with Christmas in between after the programme was announced. And we've also heard a few minutes ago to the guidance being developed over a period of time, the critical point being the funding letter in March from Scottish Government to NHS. So over those low number of weeks during the early part of 2011, we were working with Scottish Government to better define the programme level, portfolio level and project level roles of the Scottish Futures Trust across the programme.
And would you agree that there was a need to distinguish in particular the role of the SFT from the role of the technical advisors to be appointed by NHSL?
I wouldn't see that as any more significant than legal and or financial advisors. So there are advisors that the board had that was able to give them what I might call capital A advice that has professional indemnity, etc., behind it, and is professional advice to the authority. And there's the role that we had across the programme, which was to share information between projects and to provide general support in relation to the NPD elements of the programme. So it was important for the board to understand what they could rely on commercially, if you like, and what the scope was required of all of their advisors versus what we were able to assist them with from the expertise that was held in SFT.
Thank you. Did you see scope for overlap between the sort of advice the SFT was to give and the sort of advice that NHSL would be likely to get from its technical advisors?
I think the scope for overlap with technical advisors was very low, if at all. There are elements that the technical advisors would traditionally be involved in around, for example, a payment mechanism, which has a strong commercial aspect as well. So the development of I'm trying to think of areas where SFT might interact with technical advisors, and payment mechanism is a particular example of that, where the commercial and the technical come together. But it required to be clear that the advice the board could rely on, could commercially rely on, if you like, came from its advisors.
Mm. Now, Did you understand that prior to the NPD announcement, NHSL had made progress towards procuring the hospital as a capital funded project? Did you understand that?
Yes.
Yeah. And were you aware that that was using the Framework Scotland procurement route, which would have involved the use of an NEC3 contract?
Yeah.
Now, was it the case that the switch to NPD funding meant that it was no longer appropriate to use the NEC3 contract and the Framework Scotland procurement route?
Correct.
And could you just explain why that was?
Because the NEC3 contract is a contract for design and build, and the framework, the NHS Scotland frameworks, is a framework for design and build, and the NPD arrangement is for design and build and finance and maintain. So it's an entirely different scope of activity that requires a different procurement approach.
Thank you. And if we could go, please, to page 321, paragraph 7.3. There, the paper says, we will continue to work with both SFT and SGHD, which I think must be the Scottish Government Health Directorates.
You're right, yeah.
To agree the appropriate procurement approach. However, one of the key pieces of advice from SFT and other parties is to ensure the support of appropriately experienced team technical advisors at an early stage. This is also essential for the development of the reference design. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
And why was experience needed in particular for development of the reference design?
I wouldn't want to use inexperienced designers.
Yes. As simple as that. I mean, was there any particular difficulty associated with a reference design in an NPD project to distinguish it from any other construction project?
We've talked about the interaction between the design element and the commercial element. So the development of reference design and how it sits within the procurement process was important to understand.
Okay, thank you. My Lord, I note the time, and I'm aware of the inquiry's practice of taking breaks in the morning. That may be a convenient time to break.
Thank you, Mr. McLennan. Mr. Reekie, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but we usually take a coffee break at about 11:30, a little bit past 11:30, so we'll sit again at 10 to 12.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Reekie. Mr. MacLeod.
Thank you, my lord. Could we go, please, to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 354? And Mr. Reekie, you should see on screen, this is a note of a project discussion on the 1st of February 2011 with various people in attendance. You are not one of them, but Donna Stevenson from the SFT was there.
Yep.
And others included Jackie Sainsbury, Susan Goldsmith, Mike Baxter, Ian Graham. If we could go, please, to page 355, second paragraph on that page. The note records this. The meeting then discussed the design position in terms of work done and required before procurement commences. The ongoing work from BAM through Framework Scotland remains possible to add in DCN aspects. However, there are a range of risks around timescale, etc. There's really this sentence I want to ask you about. Donna Stevenson said that while SFT supported the concept of a reference design, she was surprised as to the extent of the design development being proposed. Were you aware of the SFT being surprised at the extent of design development being proposed around that time?
Yeah, I think that at this point in time, the approach to reference design and the sort of break point in design between what was done by NHS Lothian and what was done in competition by the bidders was still in discussion. And there were a range of views expressed at different times. And I think in general, at that point in time, SFT were keen that the reference design was done. I've talked about supporting it, but that we stuck to the level of operational functionality and the adjacencies of rooms and the rooms, sort of the schedule of accommodation, the general arrangement, rather than getting too much into the detail of other aspects of the design. And I couldn't tell you exactly what details of other aspects of design were being talked about in that meeting.
And what was the SFT's interest in the project getting that division right between the mandatory and the non-mandatory elements of the design?
So how far the reference design has developed slightly different from what's mandatory and non-mandatory.
That's a fair point. I'll rephrase the question. Ms. Stevenson is raising a concern about the extent of design development. What's the SFT's particular interest in the extent of design development? Well,
I guess there's a couple of interests, but to do more design than is required at that stage would cost more and take longer and risk wasted effort again if the design went to a stage that was not required for the commencement of the procurement process. So some of it will have been about cost and programme, but also if the design goes too far, then the authority, NHS Lothian in this case, has to think really carefully about whether they are getting people that are involved in that process, talked about the clinicians being involved, quite wedded, if you like, to a design development that they might not eventually get because the bidders could come and redesign elements during the procurement period. So it's about managing expectations, managing cost and programme at that stage.
If we could go to page 377 of that bundle, please. It's Bundle 3, Volume 2.
Sorry, my fault. Page?
Sorry, it's Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 377.
Thank you.
It's the funding letter that I've referred to a couple of times, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Reekie. I was going to ask you if you recognise the document, and obviously you do. It's the funding letter from the Scottish Government to health boards, dated 22nd of March 2011. And do understand that this sets out the Scottish Government's funding conditions for NPD projects being delivered by health boards?
Yes.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
If we go to page 378, please. the first paragraph that begins on that page, just read from there. The programme is being supported by the Scottish Futures Trust. SFT provides a valuable centre of expertise and advice on the development, funding, structuring, procurement and management of these projects. Procuring bodies are therefore asked to work closely with SFT throughout the development of the project. SFT's approval will be required at specific points, as detailed in section 2 and 5 of the attached guidance, in order for the project to proceed to delivery. A table outlining the forms of support which SFT can provide to procuring bodies is enclosed in a separate annex. Now, there's a reference there in that paragraph to both advice and approval. Does that identify two different aspects to the SFT's role?
Yes. I would say that the approval was an assurance role that we had that would feed into Scottish Government's approval, and advice was the advice and support we could give to individual projects that we've talked about, yes.
Okay. And if we go forward to page 379, please, you see there, headed up, anticipated scope, construction and building operating costs for the project. And there's a reference, if I just read paragraph or condition 1A, that revenue support will be provided to the procuring body from the Scottish Government up to an agreed level based on the agreed project scope using the standard form NPD / hub DBFM contract developed by SFT.
Yep.
Is that a reference there to the SFT standard form that we were discussing earlier today?
Yep.
And then paragraph B, it says derogations which relate to the underlying principles of the standard form NPD contract, as noted below, will require sign-off from the Scottish ministers, who will take advice from SFT.
Hang on 1 second, we're just going back to going up, keep going. There. That's it. Thank you. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Do you have the page?
Yeah, we're back.
You're back. So you're on conditions. See condition 1B.
Yes.
About derogations.
Yep.
Can you just explain what procedure applied if a health board wanted to derogate from the principles of the standard form contract?
So the derogations process ran through the procurement period from the form of contract that went out with the invitation to participate in dialogue, and then right up to the point of agreeing the final terms with the preferred bidder. And the standard contract had a whole range of clauses in, obviously, and if the authority wanted to change one of those, then they would have to make a submission to SFT as to why they thought they wanted to change it, and that was generally done through the authority's legal advisors to the SFT team. And in an instance where that change or derogation was for a project-specific reason, then we would allow that to be made because some particular project circumstances required changes. But if it was because of a difference in risk allocation, or just a difference in drafting style, or a difference in commercial position, then we would not allow that, because we wanted to have the market understand the nature of the commercial deal that they were getting into, and for that commercial deal to be the same across all of the projects, so that the bidding market could understand it well, so that we could keep the contracts more similar for a variety of reasons, from ongoing contract management to the generality of achieving value for money.
If the health board wanted to depart from standard form design risk allocation, that's something which would require the approval of the SFT?
The design risk allocation, as I've said, is sort of sprinkled throughout the contract in both the front end at a very high level, and in the details of what the back end of the contract, the technical schedules, technical parts of the schedule include. And if they had wanted to change the very high-level principles that are included in the clauses of the contract, then that would have required SFT's sign-off as a derogation. But again, as I said, the technical schedules were developed by the authorities and their technical advisors.
Yes, and so you understand from that that the allocation of risk, insofar as it derived from the technical schedules, not something that would require discussion with the SFT, or would it?
There was an intention to have a risk transfer that we've talked about, where design risk other than operational functionality rested with the private sector. But the elements of the document that Scottish Futures Trust owned and controlled, if you like, were the front end of the contract. So it would be possible for something that was included in a technical schedule that SFT didn't manage a derogations process for, to alter the risk transfer in relation to design. And because it could happen through a schedule where SFT didn't have oversight, that's why there's different. We didn't completely control that design risk allocation because we didn't have ownership and oversight of the whole of the contract. We just looked at the front end.
Yep. And if we look at paragraph addition 1E, it reads, in order for the project to enter procurement, the procuring body must satisfy both the Scottish Government and SFT that it has sought to minimise construction costs and operating costs within the agreed project scope and has undertaken a whole-of-life cost analysis. This will form part of the scrutiny of the outlined business case prepared for the project before approval is given for any procurement to commence. So do we see there a role for the SFT prior to the approval of the outlined business case?
Yes.
And how did the SFT go about performing that part of its role?
That was principally through design review.
Okay, and that's a subject we'll come back to. If we go, please, to page 380, paragraph 2E, this section is headed up Capacity and Governance Required to Deliver the Project Effectively. In paragraph E, the project will be required to go through gateway review, key stage review, post-project occupancy evaluation, as directed by the Scottish Government, through the development phase until financial close is reached. The review process should be undertaken in full from the earliest applicable milestone. Did the SFT play a role in relation to any of these reviews?
Yes, SFT operated the key stage review process.
And if we go to page 382, please, we should see there a heading, Project Assurance.
Yep.
And then the third paragraph there discusses key stage review. I just read from that. Key stage review provides a structured, independent due diligence review of projects, supporting project managers and sponsors at commercially critical procurement stages. Key stage reviews help to ensure that procuring authorities are sufficiently advanced in their project development and have put in place the necessary delivery arrangements and documentation in order to secure high-quality, sustainable bids. They also ensure that authorities are adequately resourced to effectively and efficiently carry out the procurement, construction and operational stages of the project. Key stage reviews are a formal requirement for all projects delivered through the NPD model and will be conducted by SFT. Does that paragraph accurately describe the key stage review role performed by the SFT?
Yes.
And was the SFT's approval needed for a project to pass the key stage review?
The SFT would say whether we believed the project was ready to proceed, and that was taken account of by Scottish Government when, as one of the funding conditions.
was this set of funding conditions the first time that progress of a project was contingent on the views of the SFT?
I believe so, yes.
And what was your understanding of the purpose of the key stage reviews?
Key stage review was a commercially led review to understand the readiness of a project to progress to different stages through the procurement process. It looked at the management arrangements in place, the resources in place for readiness. It looked at affordability and value for money. So did the project, was it still on track to be within the affordability envelope? Were the commercial terms in line with the standard terms in the contract that we'd put in place? And did it look like the procurement process was robust and going to deliver value for money in competition?
Okay, and there's a reference in that paragraph to key stage reviews being carried out at commercially critical procurement stages. And I think you set these out in your statement. It's at paragraph 41, which is page 248 of the bundle.
Yep.
And do we see there a table of the different key stage reviews which were actually carried out?
Yes.
And the conditions refer to commercially critical procurement stages. We see that each of the key milestones there is a stage in the procurement process. So we've got issue of the OGAEU notice, first of all, then the issue of the invitation to participate in dialogue and so on.
Yes.
And the invitation to participate in dialogue stage, in very broad terms, that when documents are issued to bidders setting out what the procuring body wants.
Yes.
And the paragraph that we looked at in the funding conditions letter, it says that one of the functions of the key stage review is to ensure that the procuring authorities have put in place the necessary documentation in order to secure high quality sustainable bids.
Yep.
What was the SFT's role in performing its key stage review in relation to that documentation?
I think to look at the overall suite of documents and to consider whether that overall suite of documents looked appropriate to go out to a procurement for a project of this nature.
And what sort of factors would be relevant in assessing whether it looked appropriate?
Whether it contained the sorts of information that bidders would need to bid, and whether the evaluation questions looked like they were the right sort of questions, and the scoring mechanism, as between cost and quality, for example, looked like it was in a position to drive value for money. Is
it important in general terms that documents issued to bidders accurately, clearly and unambiguously communicate the intentions of the procuring body?
Yes.
And was it an aspect of the SFT's role at the ITPD key stage review to consider that issue?
I would say at a high level it was, but we did not review all of the detail of all of the documents.
And what would be the sort of documents that you wouldn't consider to be part of the SFT's review role?
I'm struggling to call to mind the totality of an ITPD pack, but our focus would be on the procurement, valuation and commercial elements of that documentation, rather than the quite substantial volumes of technical information that would be included at that stage.
And when you refer to technical information, would that include design and specification information?
Yes.
And at the close of the... Leave that for now, thanks. There was a reference in the letter, in the paragraph above, to gateway review.
Yep.
Was the SFT involved to any extent in gateway review?
No. The gateway review was operated by Scottish Government's Procurement Programme Management Centre of Expertise, and was a long-standing assurance approach that works across all investment projects, whether they're capital projects, policy developments, or IT projects, for example.
And do you have any knowledge of their purpose, or is that a question we should leave for others?
You're probably best leaving it to others.
If we go to page 380, please. There's a section there headed Guidance and Project Resourcing. And just reading parts of that, we have a paragraph that begins, the project team should have knowledge and experience of revenue finance procurement, be able to provide a challenge function to advisors and bidders. And then reading on, the project team should have the experience and expertise necessary to successfully manage and deliver the key phases in project procurement. Specifically, and reading on, competitive dialogue process as appropriate, and have the confidence and experience to lead detailed, wide-ranging and complex negotiations with bidders in relation to the technical, commercial and financial aspects of the project.
We're struggling to keep up a wee minute. Mind? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. We're still
we're here. We're just a wee bit further down the page.
It's the same document. So, bundle 3, volume 2, page 380.
Just a bit further down. That's it. Yep.
Would it be helpful for me just to read out the parts again? Yes. So you see the section headed Guidance and Project Resourcing, Mr. Reekie?
Yes.
And then below that we have the project team should have knowledge and experience of revenue finance procurement, be able to provide a challenge function to advisors and bidders. Then below that, project team should have the experience and expertise necessary to successfully manage and deliver key phases in project procurement, specifically, and then reading on, competitive dialogue process as appropriate, and have the confidence and experience to lead detailed, wide-ranging and complex negotiations with bidders in relation to the technical, commercial and financial aspects of the project. And then carrying on over the page, in addition to the expertise outlined above, the project team must have sound knowledge of these important aspects of procuring revenue finance projects, design, risk transfer. Now, would you agree that those are all requirements of the project team?
Yes.
And was it any part of the SFT's key stage review process to assess the knowledge and experience of the project team in relation to these issues?
Yes.
And would that include their ability and experience in relation to design and risk transfer issues?
I think we look at the generality of the skills and experience of the project team, yes. Include those elements.
And to what extent did, in your view, did NHSL's team have that expertise?
Well, that several parts to that question, I guess. And at the very earliest stages, from when the project had been announced as an NPD project, we were recommending that NHS Lothian augmented their team with people who had specific experience of PPP procurement. And that was documented in December 2010. I also wrote in 2011 that we advised that the project team should have more experience of PPP project delivery, and that we wanted to agree a change to resource at the earliest opportunity. So it was a discussion that was ongoing between NHS Lothian and SFT during the early parts of 2011. We seconded briefly and informally a staff member with PPP experience into the project team in June, July 2011 time. My colleague Gordon Sharef, who I referred to earlier, Gordon was not with the team very long. There were some differences of opinion on how to and personalities on how to make things work in the project team that was an existing project team in NHS Lothian. Gordon went on to work with the two other acute hospital projects in the NPD programme. But as I understand it, as I recall, NHS Lothian augmented its project team with director of capital planning and some more input from maybe the deputy director of finance to bring more commercial expertise and understanding to their project team. And at the point of the pre-ODU KSR, when the advisory teams were all in place, we acknowledged that we'd made a number of recommendations as to the resourcing throughout the project, and that we were content with the resourcing that was in place by that stage in December 2012. So it was an ongoing discussion about the team resourcing for that period of 2011 and 2012. Okay.
In your answer there, you made reference to NHSL augmenting its team with, I think, two of its employees. Yeah. And I think the positions you gave were Director of Capital Planning and perhaps a Deputy Finance Director.
I believe so.
Are you able to recall their names?
I think that was Ian Graham and Carol Potter.
Ian Graham and Carol
Potter?
Carol Potter. Okay. One of the passages that we read out from the letter referred to the need for the project team to have sound knowledge of design and risk transfer in the context of revenue finance projects. Why is that important?
Because the interaction we talked about between the technical design aspects and the procurement commercial side is really important in any project development, and so knowing how that works and what are the expectations in the PPP arrangements is one of the things that the team would have to have an understanding of, the interaction between the commercials and the technical development.
Is it the case that a mishandled procurement might lead to the Health Board taking on more risk for design than they intended?
Yes.
If we could go on, please, to page 383 of that document, which is it's still Bundle 3, Volume 2, we're in page 383. You should see there, Mr. Reekie, a page headed up 3 requirements for value for money assessment and business cases.
Yep.
Reading, first of all, under the heading Outline Business Case Stage, Condition 3A, The procuring body is required to submit an outline business case to the Scottish Government, a shadow bid model, which demonstrates how the project will deliver value for money in quantitative and qualitative terms. The OBC must be in line with Green Book guidance, the Scottish Public Finance Manual, and appropriate sector-specific guidance as outlined in Section 4. Then B, before the project can enter procurement, the outline business case must be approved by the procuring body, ultimately the Scottish Ministers. SFT will have an oversight role and will provide comment to the Scottish Ministers prior to their formal approval. And without reading them out, we can see below that paragraphs E and F are to similar effect, but in the particular context of the full business case. Do you see that?
Yep.
Do those paragraphs accurately describe the role performed by the SFT at each of these stages?
Yes.
And how did the SFT go about that role at those stages?
We ran at the outline business case stage a design review, which looked at the high-level space required to deliver the outcomes that the project was looking for and the cost implications of that space as a high-level assessment of value for money. And then we used the key stage review process to be able to feed in, particularly at the full business case stage, where there was a key stage review aligned with the full business case for the project at the point of the selection of or the signature of the contract.
The SFT's role at the OBC and FBC stages is described as an oversight role. Did that mean that their approval was needed for the project to progress?
It meant that the Scottish Government would take account of our comments in deciding about the project of the progress of the project.
So do we understand that the Scottish Government had a decision-making role at each of these stages?
Yeah.
And the SFT were feeding in advice to that process, is that?
I guess, yeah, SFT will have an oversight role and will provide comment to Scottish ministers prior to their formal approval.
And do you know if the Scottish Government process referred to there is the one conducted by the Capital Investment Group?
I would expect that to be the case, yeah.
And on what sort of issues was the SFT expected to provide comment at each of these stages?
On value for money, on affordability, on the commercial terms, and on the readiness of the documentation and the team to proceed to the next stage.
Excuse me just a moment, Mr. Reekie.
No problem.
Could I refer, please, to the witness statement of Brian Curry, which is starts at page 201 of the witness statement bundle. But the particular paragraph I'd like to go to is paragraph 28, which is at page 210. And I'm just going to read what Mr. Curry says there. He says the project team initially intended to complete the reference design within 12 months, based on 3 rounds of consultation with clinical staff. The Project Board immediately sought to reduce this period to 8 months, with 2 rounds of clinical engagement. My recollection is that it was SFT who sat on the Project Board who were keen to shorten the programme of activities in relation to the reference design production, competitive dialogue, and between preferred bidder and financial close, rather than NHS Lothian. Do you accept what Mr. Curry says there as accurate?
Could we go to another document to have a look at that?
Would you like to go to the document that's referred to in that paragraph, or is it another one?
Yeah, I think it's the. Yes, please.
Okay, so if we could go to bundle 7, page 687, please.
So if we just look at the strategic programme there, number 2, heading 2.
Sorry, Mr. Reekie, just bear with us a moment till His Lordship has
Yes.
the document.
I mean, I've got that document, but Mr. Reekie, is that the document you want to look at? Or
Yeah, so there's a heading 2, strategic programme.
Right.
Just to put this in its context, Mr. Reekie, do we see here that this is headed up Action Notes, and it's given a meeting title, RHSC DCN Little France Project Board number 2, and it's dated the 13th of May 2011.
Yeah.
And there are various attendees at the meeting, including from the SFT, Donna Stevenson and Andrew Bruce, but you yourself were not at the meeting.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so please take what you wish from this document.
So in heading 2, strategic programme, the second paragraph says, as presented, the programme is unacceptable to NHSL, SFT and SGHD, given the estimated slippage in operational date from the previous Treasury funded project. So whilst I wasn't at the meeting, from that I take it that all of the parties involved, the government, NHS Lothian and Scottish Futures Trust, were not content with the programme and therefore wanted to see it accelerated.
Yes. And so when Mr. Curry says it was his recollection that it was the SFT who wanted to shorten the programme of activities and so on, rather than NHS Lothian, would you, based on what's said in that minute, disagree with what Mr. Curry has to say?
I think there's a further down part that says SFT and SGHD expressed a strong view on the period for competitive dialogue, but the generality of the programme issue, it seems to me from that note that all parties wish to see the programme accelerated.
Okay. Do you accept that the SFT wanted to shorten the programme of activities in relation to reference design production, competitive dialogue, and the period between preferred bidder and financial close?
SFT, yes, acting on the funding letter and the position that the government had taken overall, and that we all had taken in relation to the need to do this work as quickly as possible, which we talked about much earlier on. We did want to make sure that there was no unnecessary floating programmes and that programmes were compressed as far as they could reasonably be, yes.
Okay, so was the SFT bringing to this desire to make progress experience and expertise about the timescales needed to conduct a procurement process properly?
Yes, we had experienced that.
Was there any extent to which the SFT's recommendations for timescales or ways in which they might be shortened was in any sense against the wishes of NHSL?
I don't recall the detail of those discussions. I'm afraid I wasn't in.
Thank you. Could we go please to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 399? And you can take it from me, Mr. Reekie, that this is a letter from you. See your signing block on page 408 of the bundle. And it's to Jackie Sainsbury of NHS Lothian, dated the 1st of June 2011. And just reading from the first page of that letter, you say, further to the letter NHS Lothian received on 22nd March 2011 from the Scottish Government with regard to the funding conditions for delivering projects through the non-profit distributing model. Pause there, that's the funding letter we looked at a moment ago.
Indeed.
We are following up on certain specific matters as they relate to the funding of the combined project. Then reading down under the heading Funding Conditions and Construction Costs, the letter of 22nd March 2011 made it clear that the Scottish Government would fund 100% of construction costs, subject to a scope for construction being agreed between the procuring body and the Scottish Government, which will be supported by SFT in this assessment. Below is how we propose to reach agreement on the scope of the project and therefore how a cap on this element of funding will be set. Then reading on over the next page, as part of an updated key stage review process that will be applied uniformly on NPD projects in the health sector, we propose to engage in the ongoing design process of the project, provide an independent review and challenge the overall size of this facility and its specification on behalf of the ultimate funder of the project. To do this, we are likely to employ an external advisor. This should provide independent validation of some of the key high-level metrics of the proposed design and a valuable external benchmark on value for money. The output from this review will be a report giving an opinion as to the efficiency of the design.
If I may, there was a bit at the top of that page that I know you didn't read all of it, but there was a bit of that which says, and its specification using the cost per square metre as a measure.
Yes.
So the element of size, and as I've said, at a very high level, the highest level of what's the cost of the building going to be is the cost per square metre, which is a very high level proxy for the level of the specification. So that's the level we were looking at.
Okay, thank you. What's being described in this letter, does this relate to the Scottish Government funding conditions?
Yes.
And what is the relationship between what's proposed here and those funding conditions?
The funding conditions would provide a funding envelope for the project, the maximum amount of capital cost equivalent that would be funded through the NPD programme, and the review, the independent review that we mention in here, would be a benchmarking of the capital cost to support the Scottish Government's assessment of whether that was reasonable to deliver St John's Hospital and Department for Clinical Neurosciences, and therefore should be funded 100% as part of the programme.
And did that proposed design review take place?
It did.
And who did it? That
was done by a company called Atkins on behalf of and contracted to the Scottish Futures Trust.
Okay. And you may already have dealt with this, so apologies if I'm asking you to repeat yourself, but the description in that letter talks about a review and challenge to the overall size of the facility and its specification. What aspects of the specification were the subject of the review?
The specification being the overall costing of the building, which the size plus the cost per square metre as a very high level proxy for the level of a specification is what we were looking at. So there are general benchmarks, and the Atkins report will contain a number for what is a reasonable cost per square metre for an acute healthcare building. And if you have what I suppose some would call an over-specified building, then it could cost more. Or if you have an under-specified building that doesn't look like it's of the required quality, then it might have a much lower cost per square metre than a normal benchmark for that sort of facility.
Okay. And to what extent would an assessment of cost at that level include consideration of such things as the specification of the ventilation system in the hospital?
It wouldn't.
One presumes that the costing would assume the hospital would feature a ventilation system.
So the cost per square metre of the average acute hospital would include the ventilation system of the average acute hospital. So at that very high level of proxy for specification, then if there had been no ventilation system in the costings, then it would have looked, the costings might have looked a bit low.
Yes. Thank you. If we could go on to page 406 of that letter, please. The second paragraph, just picking up about, well, I think it's the third sentence, about 4 lines from the top. The sentence begins at the right-hand side. We are also concerned that the architects employed to carry out the reference design for the project are not restricted from working for one of the bidders once this stage is complete. This will make it difficult to create a level playing field amongst bidders for the project, as at least the perception will be that whichever bidder employs this architect will be at a significant advantage. We would welcome a dialogue with you as to how these issues are resolved. Can you just explain that concern and if and how it was resolved, please?
Yeah, the concern was that if a firm of architects developed the reference design for the authority working on contract to the health board and were then free to join a bid team, then they would understand at a lot more detailed level what the authority was looking for, because they would have worked with them already to help develop the reference design, would have a much greater knowledge of the things that were important to the individuals who would be assessing the bids than would be the case for an architect who hadn't had that previous insight. So it could have the potential to create an uneven playing field between the consortium that had the services of that architectural firm and those that did not, to make them more likely to win the tender competition.
And was this concern addressed in any way?
I can't recall the detail of that, I'm afraid.
If you could go please to Bundle 3, Volume 2, page 484. You should see there, Mr. Reekie, that this is a paper for the Infrastructure Investment Board dated the 26th of September 2011.
Yep.
And it's discussing the combined project. And if we could just go to paragraph 13, please, on page 486. And I'll let you read that paragraph if you want to, Mr. Reekie, but all I want to ask about it is it's referring to the reference design being developed by NHS Lothian. And then in the final sentence, it says, that as part of a needs not wants challenge, SFT is undertaking an independent review of the design.
Yep.
Do you accept the description of the SFT review as a needs not wants challenge? And if so, what do you understand by that?
That was language that we used at the time, and it was intended. We've already been through that the funding was based on minimising the cost to deliver the outcomes. I think that was in the Scottish Government's funding letter that we've reviewed already. And therefore, our review was to ensure that the cost envelope that was being put forward by the procurer authority reflected actually what was needed to deliver those outcomes, and not anything else that people might want to add in along the way was not actually needed to deliver the outcomes of the overall project.
Okay. And then slightly higher up in the paragraph, just starts in the third line, says that this means that most of the design development, except in relation to mechanical and electrical design, will be done before the project enters procurement, rather than bidding contractors preparing detailed designs themselves. Do you know whether the design and specification information reviewed by Atkins included or excluded any mechanical and electrical design?
I don't know whether the information that was given to them included any mechanical or electrical design. I wouldn't have expected them to need to review any element of mechanical or electrical design to fulfil the requirements of the contract that we had with them for the design review.
And I think you've perhaps already explained it, but could you just explain why you wouldn't have expected that?
Yes, because the review was principally a spatial review to understand whether the size of the building and the number of square metres, which is a big driver of cost, was about right to deliver the clinical services of the Royal Hospital St Children and Department of Clinical Neurosciences. So the specialties involved, the throughput of patients, the amount of treatment, and all of the ancillary services that go along with that, and whether the cost per square metre for that space benchmarked to a reasonable level for an acute hospital facility. That is about spatial design and costing, not about the detail of any structural or mechanical or electrical design element.
Okay, thank you. If we could go next, please, to Bundle 7, page 455.
Thank you.
And we can see that this is headed up Scottish Government governance arrangements for Royal Hospital for Sick Children outline business case. If we scroll forward to page 457, I hope you can see there that the paper is prepared by Mike Baxter of the Scottish Government and is dated the 7th of October 2011. The recommendation is inviting the project board to note the arrangements for outline business case consideration within the Scottish Government. If we could just go, please, to paragraph 10. What Mr. Baxter says there is the process, sorry, that's on page 456. Process within Scottish Government for consideration of the OBC is unchanged from that which NHS Lothian colleagues would be familiar with. At present, a number of other bodies, including Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland, feed into the overall approval process. It is expected that the SFT consideration of VFM, which I think is value for money, and other issues referred to in the 22 March letter will form part of the overall CIG assessment process. In that regard, there's therefore no separate board approval within SFT for approval of the RHSC DCN project, and that this will be part of the Scottish Government's consideration as normal. And first of all, do you agree that the SFT design review would feed into the capital investment group process for approval of the business case?
Yes.
And there's reference in this paragraph to the involvement of Architecture and Design Scotland, Health Facilities Scotland. What was your understanding of their role in the context of that business case review process?
I believe they have a role providing advice to Capital Investment Group on design and technical aspects of business cases, but I'm not particularly familiar with that.
If you take, if you don't know, then please just say. I don't want you to feel compelled to answer questions you don't know the answers to. But if we take HFS in particular, what do you know of their area of expertise insofar as it pertains to hospital design?
That Health Facilities Scotland is the health services central grouping of technical expertise on health facilities.
Are you aware of what role, if any, they would have in relation to, for example, technical guidance for engineering installations in hospitals?
I believe they have ownership of the design standards, the Scottish Health Technical Memoranda.
And from your point of view, how was the SFT design review carried out by Atkins intended to relate to the roles of HFS and Architecture and Design Scotland?
We knew what our design review was for and what the specification of it was going to do in relation to value for money, and we've talked through that. We didn't have a view of how that would interact with other reviews that may or may not have been going on. We wanted to be clear that other parties like Health Services Scotland, Architecture and Design Scotland knew what we were doing and knew what the Atkins review had said and did, but we weren't able to give a view on what that meant for other parties' reviews.
Who was responsible, in your view, for understanding how all three of these bodies' design input related to one another?
Given that they all fed into the CIG process, which was operated by Scottish Government, I would have said that they were responsible for that overall coordination, but Scottish Government would have fulfilled that role by setting out the overall framework for the business case process in documentation such as the Scottish Capital Investment Manual and the letters to chief executives, which it would have then been the responsibility for health boards to follow.
Are you aware of any document which demarcates the three design, or the input on design from the three bodies, being the SFT, Architecture and Design Scotland and Health Facilities Scotland?
I'm not.
Could we go please to bundle 4, page 99? Now, you should have in front of you there, Mr. Reekie, a letter dated the 2nd of June 2010 from the Health Finance Directorate of the Scottish Government. And you can see in the column down the right-hand side that it's addressed to various bodies, including NHS boards, Health Facilities Scotland, Architecture and Design Scotland, and so on. The Scottish Futures Trust is not listed there as a recipient. Is this a document that you've seen before or are familiar with?
I believe I've seen it as part of this process, but I don't believe I'd seen it before that.
Okay. It's headed up a Policy on Design Quality for NHS Scotland 2010 revision. And I'll just read some passages from it and come to some questions. If we could go first of all to page 100, paragraph 6. Just picking up from the sentence that begins on page 100. Support for the implementation of the design agenda be provided by means of coordinated tripartite working arrangement between Scottish Government Health Directorates, Health Facilities Scotland and Architecture and Design Scotland to facilitate the procurement of well-designed, sustainable healing environments which support the policies and objectives of NHS boards, the Scottish Government Health Directorates. And then reading down at paragraph 10 on page 100, says that in order to meet the above objectives, Architecture and Design Scotland will deliver 3 main activities on behalf of SGHD. Activity 2, providing in partnership with HFS coordinated assessment of the potential quality of proposed projects to support those responsible for decision making with the business case process. This will involve contributing particular expertise on the aspects of design relating to government policy on design, placemaking, to a process administered and led by HFS, who will, in addition to the administrative elements, provide particular expertise on the aspects of design relating to functionality, particularly technical and sustainability standards developed by HFS and the Department of Health for England. And then paragraph 11 on page 101, headed up Design Assessment and the Business Case Process. An assessment of design quality is now part of the SGHD business case process. All projects submitted to the SGHD Capital Investment Group for approval are now subject to an assessment of design quality and functionality, including technical and sustainability standards. This design assessment will take place at the initial agreement, outline business case, and full business case stages of approval. Now, with apologies for the length of that introduction, I'll now come to the questions. To what extent was SFT's design review through Atkins intended to fulfil the objectives of this policy?
The Atkins review was very particularly in relation to value for money and an affordability envelope for the project, and not to assess design quality.
To what extent was the SFT's design review through Atkins intended to consider compliance with technical standards developed or published by HFS, such as Scottish Health Technical Memoranda?
It wasn't.
And what, if anything, was the intended relationship between the SFT's design review and this policy?
It's separate. So the SFT's design review was in relation to value for money applied to the NPD projects and the affordability within the overall programme, whereas this, I think, go back to the title, was a policy around design quality.
Was it ever suggested or understood by you that SFT were to be involved in the design assessment process referred to in this policy?
I don't believe so, no.
If we could go please to page 122, that bundle. So this is the design policy document which is attached or enclosed with the letter that we've just been looking at. And there's a section here headed up Role of the Scottish Futures Trust. And just reading from that, it says, Scottish Futures Trust is an independent company established by the Scottish Government with the responsibility to deliver value for money across all public sector investment. SFT operates at arm's length from government, works closely with the public sector to seek and deliver improved value for taxpayers. I think that's an overview you would accept to be accurate.
Indeed.
And then there's various other bits and pieces said there, and then right at the bottom it says, SFT may also get involved in an advisory or validation role on other projects, therefore has an interest across all healthcare work. Do you accept that as a general statement?
It's a very general statement, but yes.
And do you know why the SFT was mentioned in this particular design policy?
I guess because design is an aspect of infrastructure investment, and SFT has a role and has also an interest in infrastructure investment. Therefore, there is an interaction of those two things. The high quality design was a generality of a thing that everyone involved in the infrastructure environment is looking for.
Was it a matter of interest or relevance to the SFT in performing its function, whether or not a project, a hospital project, complied with technical guidance?
Sorry, could you just repeat that? My fault, Mr. McLean. Could you just repeat the question?
Indeed, I stumbled over it, so it's probably helpful to do it again. Was it a matter of interest or relevance to the SFT when performing its function, whether or not a hospital project complied with technical guidance?
It has to be a matter of interest, because it's not value for money to pay for something that doesn't do the job that it's intended to do. And the standards and guidance that are in place across a whole variety of sectors are there to try and make sure that the things that we buy do the job that they're there to do.
And was it any part of the SFT's function to check or confirm whether a hospital project was complying with technical guidance?
No.
My Lord, I note the time, and as it happens, that's a convenient break in my own examination, so Lordship may wish to stop for lunch.
Yes, Ms. McLean. We'll take about an hour for lunch, Mr. Reekie, so can I ask you to be back at 2 o'clock?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Perhaps Mr. Reekie could be taken out.